The last topic that we have for HTML is the web form. The web form is a very important component simply because of all the use cases that we have for it. Everything that we've spoken about up to this point is us delivering content to the end user. We create text, we present videos, we present images, we present other web pages. We provide links that go from one page to another. All of that is just information that we are dumping on the end user. The web form is unique, and this is one of the core features in HTML where we're actually receiving information from the end user. If you think about use cases for a web form, the Google search feature, that's a web form. Logging into any website from YouTube to Facebook, those are all web forms. Creating a post on a social media platform, a user is using a web form. So we're gonna go over some of the basics. This is part one of generating a form. This is how you effectively create the front end for the form. And then when we dive into PHP, we'll talk about what to do with that data once a user submits their form. So to start, we have a parent element, form. And inside of here, we need at least 2 inputs, and let's get a label in there so that the user knows exactly what they're submitting. So we'll start off with the label tag, and the label tag is just to identify what the form field is doing. So we'll write a label for name. We'll create an input so that the user could submit their name, and then we'll create the input field. Now, the input field is a little unique inside of the web form. I told you earlier, the tag name determines the behavior of your HTML element. If I use a H1, it's going to look very different than if I use a paragraph. If I use an image tag, it's going to look very different than if I use an audio tag. It's going to behave very different. With the input is very versatile, and the behavior of the input is actually stored in an attribute called type. So let's take a look at that. So if I create a type over here and I set it to text, then I get a text input, and you can see it over here, and the user can go in and start typing in a little amount of text. This is meant to store something like a name or an address. It's not meant to carry a paragraph full of text. We have a separate HTML tag for that. So just with this, we're going to jump over to the next input that we are going to need. So I'm going to create a break tag over here, and let's create another input. And as you can see, the two of them look alike right now, but let's go and play around with the type attribute, and let's set this one to submit. So these are 2 input fields, and the 2 input fields have different types. The first one has a type equal to text. The second one has a type equal to submit, and it creates a submit button. When it comes to inputs, the value that you put inside of the type attribute determines the behavior of that input. So this is the bare minimum that you would need for a web form. You need a label so that the user knows exactly what type of information you're expecting them to fill in here. You need a submit input, and that will tell the browser that the user has finished the form and that is ready to submit the data to the backend. In addition to the type attribute, we do have a couple of other attributes that we can use. For instance, there is the name attribute, and the name attribute is so that when we go into the backend and we start programming exactly what we want to do with this data, we could identify which form field we're talking about, which data we want to grab. And we could do things like we could say, take this data, for instance, and let's store it inside of a database inside of this specific column. We could do a lookup. We could say, look for this name inside of a database. We could say, store this name as what's known as a session variable, which it will propagate throughout the rest of the session of the site so that you'll see that same name show up over and over again, no matter what page the user goes on. So there's a lot of use cases for saying, here's a bunch of data, and I want to grab the NM data and do something specific with that. The name attribute allows us to identify this particular set of data inside of my web form and do things with it. I'm going to close out this part over here so that we have a little bit more space to work with. Another thing that we have is placeholder, and placeholder allows us to fill in some pre-populated data so that the user knows exactly what to expect. So for instance, here I have a name field, so here I could put in some placeholder text saying Bob so that the user knows, oh, I'm supposed to put my name in there. And then another attribute that we can play around with is required. What required does is it sets a parameter on the browser that says that the user cannot submit this form while leaving this input blank. So by having that there, I'm going to save this and refresh over here. I'm leaving this empty. We have the value of Bob over here, the placeholder text of Bob over here. I'm going to hit submit, and as you can see, I get a warning saying we're not going to process this data because you left a form input blank. So now let's go in and fill this out. So I'm going to put in the value of Joe, for example. And now when I hit submit, it now processes the data. The data doesn't really go anywhere because we haven't configured that yet, but the submit button did work. It sent the data out. It just didn't go anywhere. One more attribute that we can use is the value attribute. And we'll see this a few times as we start diving into other input types and other HTML web form elements. In this case of submit, the default value is what text shows up inside the button over here. We can overwrite that. Right now on my preview over here, it says submit. I have seen it say like query submit in some other browsers. Like I think my phone will say query submit. I think I've seen that also on Safari. If we want to overwrite that and say something like send or post, then we can use the value attribute and set it to whatever text we want inside of that button. So for instance, I want it to say send. Now the value attribute is essentially saying what is stored inside of this field. So as you can see over here, the name field is currently empty, but I can hard code and I can say what I want that value to be initially. So right now I set the inside of the name field over here, I set the value to Sue. And if I refresh this, it says Sue automatically. If I remove that, now the value is empty and we can see the placeholder text for Bob. And now when I type in Joe, the value for this input is now set to Joe. So when I hit send, the value for this name field will be Joe. But by default, if I were to hit send at this point, the value would be Sue. So the default behavior that we have for our web form right now is when I come into this page, some placeholder text for Bob, and if I hit send, I'm going to receive an error because this input is currently empty. So I go in and I type in the value of Joe, and now that I've filled in that field, I hit send, and that data is packaged up, and inside of that data for the input field NM, I have the value of Joe. So that means that once we start building out the backend, we could do things and say we want Joe to be stored somewhere, or we want to do something with that value of Joe. Let's play around with a couple more inputs. So I'm going to clone this over and let's play around with email. So let's create an email field. There's an input over here. The type is now going to be set to email, and let's give this a unique name. Let's use EML, short for email. And for the placeholder, we'll set this to bob@gmail.com. So it's the same syntax as what we have above for name. We just change the values that were stored in each one of these attributes. Similar to the text input, for the email input, we have a few additional checks that the browser will go through for the email field. So let's take a look at those. If I type in Joe over here and then try to hit send, we get that error message again. This field is required, and that's because we have that required attribute over here. If I were to type in just the value of Joe and try to hit send, we now have additional error messages that are showing up. The browser knows that an email requires an @ symbol. So let me type in @ symbol in. So now our value is set to Joe @. And when I hit send again, it's saying that it's still not fitting the format of a typical email. Usually there's some text before the @ symbol, and then there's some text after the @ symbol. So let me go in and start typing in the rest of that. So that's gmail.com. So now I have an actual email format over here. And now when I hit send, the submission was successful. So all those little additional checks, making sure that there is an @ symbol, making sure that there's text in front of the @ symbol as well as behind the @ symbol, all of those things are happening because we set the type to email. Let's take a look at a couple of other input fields. So I'm going to clone this over one more time, and this time let's look for a telephone number. So I'm going to write in tel. The input type for this is also tel, and for the name, write in TL, short for telephone, and for the placeholder, we'll pop in a phone number. So 212-123-4567. That's our placeholder phone number. And as you can see over here, we are expecting a phone number. And if I type in a phone number, the browser will submit the form. Okay, let's clone this over again. And this time let's play around with password. So I'm going to type in password over here. The type for this is password. The name, we'll just write in PW, for short for password. And for passwords, we don't need a placeholder. And over here, I'm going to type in ABC. So let me pre-fill out the previous fields over here. And as you can see, password will automatically take whatever value value you typed in this case it was ABC, and it converted it over to these bullet points so that somebody looking over my shoulder as a user filling this out won't be able to see what I'm typing. And with that set, this data was submitted. At this point, we have a form. This form has 5 inputs. This one has the type set to text. This one has a type set to email. This one has a type set to tell. And this one has the type set to password. And this one has the type set to submit. So all of these are using the same HTML tag input, but by determining different types, we are changing the behavior of the input. Let's play around with radio buttons. So a radio button is something that we can provide options for the user to select, and by default the behavior is that we want the user to select one option out of a set of options. So let's build that out. In here I'm going to add in a paragraph for gender, and one thing that I want to note here is that inside of your form tag, as you can see, my form tag currently starts off at line 7 and ends at line 29. So far what we've been doing is just adding in form elements, labels, and inputs. In this case, I'm also adding in a paragraph tag. And one thing that you can do with this form tag is you can add in other HTML elements. I could have an image inside of this form somewhere. I could have a video inside of this form somewhere. That is completely within the spec for HTML5. One thing to note is that your inputs for a form should not be outside of the form tag. So this will create an error when you're trying to process your form because this input is now outside of that parent element of form. So going back to our radio button, I've used a p tag over here just to indicate what these radio buttons are going to be. Start off with the label just like we did above. So here's the label tag. The one difference I'm going to make here is that I wanted to show the radio button first and then the value for it right after it. So I'm going to start off with input, close it up, and then I will follow it up with the label for this radio button. In this case, we're going to start off with male. And as you can see, it's automatically giving us this text input. I want to change that to a radio. So we're going to type in type equals radio. And now I have a radio button that's clickable, and I can see that the label that I'm selecting over here is male. So let's go in and let's create a name for this radio button so that we could do things with this later. And we're going to set it to GDR, short for gender. And just because the label says male, we need to specify what data we want to send to the backend. So over here, I'm going to use the value field and I'm going to set it equal to M. So let's talk about this for a second. I am creating a web form. This web form has some information on the user like their name, their email, a password, a telephone number, and I also want to capture gender. After this app goes live, a few months goes in, I get hundreds of submissions on this web form. I then want to go in and just check some demographic data. I want to see how many people identify as male inside of my system. So if I were to use that text field for gender, if we are talking about just people that identify as male, they could type in a variety of different things. They could type in male lowercase, male uppercase, male capitalized. They could type in man. They could type in boy. There's a variety of different things that they could type in there. And all I want to do is identify all the people that identify as male in my system. So that makes it a little bit harder to take a look at all those different fields and determine what they meant by what they entered into that text field. Here, what's happening is that I limited the option. If you identify as male, boy, man, any of those terms, you select male, and the value that's going to go into my database would be simply M. That makes it a lot easier to identify the demographic of people that identify as male just by looking for M inside of that field. I could easily do that. I could easily capture that. I could easily count that. So I can say, oh, this percentage of people have M assigned to their gender inside of my database. So let's expand out here. So I can go in and I can clone this. And for the rest of these, we'll create different labels. Let's do female. And for this last one, we'll do non-binary. I know there's more, but just for the sake of brevity. Now, I have 3 form fields over here for male, female, and non-binary. And what I want to do, just to wrap this up, is to change each one of the values. Right now, if somebody were to select female, M would be passed to the backend. So I want to change this value to F for female, and for non-binary, we'll set it to N. At this point, we're done with the radio input. input because this is working great. I have a set of options and the user can only select one of the set of options. If they select male, the value that will be passed to the backend will be M. If they select female, the value that will be passed to the backend is F. And if they select non-binary, the value that will be passed back is N. So this is working great. One thing I want to call out here is that I have 3 inputs over here. They are all the type of radio. I want to group them all together where only one value will be passed to the database. And in order to do that, the name fields all need to be shared. So the name field for name up here is NM, the one for here is EML, the one for here is TL, the one for here is PW, but all 3 of these are GDR. And just to show you what would happen if the name fields were not all the same, I'm going to remove the R for female, save that, refresh over here, and now I could select male or non-binary, but I could also select female. So for GDR, I could grab that data, but GD over here would be a separate piece of data that would be passed back to the system, and that could potentially cause issues depending on what you're doing in the backend. If I want all 3 of these radio buttons to be grouped together, then they must all have the same name. So here I have name GDR, and name GDR. They are now all sharing the same name attribute. Now, if we want the user to select more than one option, then instead of using radio buttons, we could use checkboxes. Checkboxes work the exact same way as radio buttons. The whole setup is pretty identical. The only difference is that instead of using type of radio, we use type of checkbox. So here is an example of checkboxes. Again, I'm starting off with a paragraph that says reply through, and that's just to say, how do you want us to reply back to you? And we give 2 options, one for phone and one for email. The user could select one or they could select multiple. Looking at the syntax over here, we do have the same thing that we saw with radio buttons where the name attribute is identical in both of these inputs. The labels are different. So this one says phone, this one says email. The values are different. So this one says tell and this one says email. And the type is simply set to checkbox as opposed to radio. So if you set your input type to radio, you'll get this behavior where the user can select one out of many. And if you use type checkbox, then the user could select any combination. They could select multiple options from your many options.